I am so grateful to be here today at the invitation of my beloved friend, Matthew Taylor, who greeted me with a warm smile and a hearty laugh in drum space at General Assembly years ago, and who I was blessed to serve with this past year on drum. I would also like to thank Reverend Savage for her love and support. I wish I could be here live with you all via Zoom, but I am away celebrating my abuela's, my grandmother's 95th birthday this weekend in Miami. Please know it is a true gift and blessing to be included in sacred virtual space with you all. My heart is with you today. Permit me to begin this offering with a guided meditation. As we prepare ourselves for this time, I invite you to invite in a breath. I invite you in that breath to get in a position that feels most true to you. You may sit, you may stand, maybe you're at home, maybe you're lying down. Release what strain you can in your body as you are able, if you are able. Maybe there is something you can't release quite yet, something you feel is tight. That's okay. Wherever you are where you need to be in this moment. In this moment, as we take a deep breath into the stillness and complexity and pain of who we are becoming, I invite your heart to summon what you deem sacred text. Perhaps you have a favorite, or if it's hard to choose a favorite, at least the one that comes to your mind and heart in this moment. You may, as you're able, recite it in your head. Maybe you've memorized it, planted it in your heart. As you continue to savor your sacred text, perhaps you might ask, how did you arrive at this sacred text? Who introduced you to it? Perhaps more importantly, how did you know it was sacred? Did someone tell you it was? Or was there something it planted within you? An idea, a longing, a new path to becoming that has led you here today. As we come back from this time of guided meditation, I invite you to take in another deep breath, releasing it as we re-enter the space of together. Writer, Catholic convert, and Trappist monk Thomas Merton knew the Psalms and also filled his journals with scriptures from other religions and poetic traditions. For those who read Merton, we hold his words like prayers in our hearts, a gift of the holy during moments of need. In New Seeds of Contemplation, he writes, every moment in every event of every person's life on earth plants something in their soul. Such seeds as these cannot spring up anywhere except in the good soil of freedom, spontaneity, and love. The metaphor of the seed as thought, seed as the product of love, as precursor to compassionate deeds, is not a new one. But perhaps it's in the old that we are reminded of a knowledge once lost to us, which we might now feel dewy fresh in the newness of being and of seeing. For some, their sacred text isn't on the written page. It isn't in a church, a mosque, a synagogue. It's in the soil. It's in the water. For my maternal grandfather, Orlando Perez, he implicitly speaks of seeds and soil and growing as if it's scripture. Raised on a farm in Cuba, he began working at the age of 7 and learned from un viejito how to use un palito de guayaba in search of water in the soil. He says, when it comes to planting and growing, it's all about access to water. He identifies as Catholic, and while I've never heard him quote scripture, the way he speaks to me about learning to navigate the natural world from those who were técnicos de la naturaleza seems sacred to him somehow. And the teaching from them, the text. And I wonder if there weren't a few of you listening here today who felt the same when I asked you to think of a text. If some wanted to reach for something else than was perhaps what might generally be expected or accepted. When considering the topic of sacred text and growing traditions such as these, there is no scripture to speak of. Are we to say that the people, African and Taino and Guanahatabey, who were enslaved in Cuba by the Spanish monarch, had no unwritten prophetic messages of their own to impart? Or perhaps it was the readers and power brokers in those stories who wished not to read them as sacred, keeping so many of us, years later, from the privilege of this embodied earthly knowledge. As you can guess, I don't have that guava stalk divining rod to draw from, or the knowledge that came with it. I haven't ever seen one. There are those among us who wish to remember the seeds that men have forgotten. The work of independent Black feminist scholar Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which has shown up in a number of Harvard Divinity School classes this year, pushes back on the notion of what is sacred text and what bears holding. Imbued with a divine and prophetic language of its own, Gumbs invites us to challenge who gets to decide what archival scripture is or isn't, and who or what gets to show up in it, and as readers in our lives. She writes, simply put, every piece of the planet was filled with trash, our bodies included. It started on our tongues. Everyone thought it was the water. The lack of water, the genetically processed seeds that didn't need water to thrive. It hurt to move, it hurt to breathe, and when our eyes swole shut, we couldn't see. And then we finally saw. We saw it. We hadn't told the truth in so damn long. Gumbs' reading speaks of truth. Well, of not telling it. But I have a feeling now that there are so many truths you all have been facing head on these past 14 months. We have been holding so much, many of us in physical isolation, and if not physical, emotional or even spiritual isolation. Gumbs' M archive reminds, no, it emboldens me to a sacred call to question prescribed ways of being, likely because the work itself defies and transcends traditional categorization. Some may argue that we should not be quick to categorize this work as sacred text, that it's the role of those engaged in active scriptural interpretation to bring religiously codified works in conversation with the present day. Yet these categories and constructs that propel us forward toward greater clarity in communication simultaneously confound our abilities to believe into new ways of being and seeing one another in our fullness, in our sacredness. We are archival scripture. We are sacred texts. We are living, breathing human beings whose choices rest in what parts of ourselves, our histories, our traditions we wish to uplift and draw out into the present. And I say rest because rest is so often the least of our priorities. A truth I discovered this January after full speed ahead during 10 months of the pandemic is that I didn't know how to rest. What's more, I didn't know how to give myself the necessary space to extend that kind of compassion to myself. It's something I discovered in a conversation with a friend and peer chaplain while I was preparing for a week-long silent retreat. I was freaking out. How am I going to do it? How am I not going to speak to anyone for a week? How am I going to stay in my own thoughts? It's something I always wanted to do. And when finally given the opportunity to do so as part of my spiritual training in my first year of divinity school, it was terrifying. But she held me in prayer. And her prayer for me, it was that I would discover what it meant to rest. And I did for a time, but more on that later. Before a seed is planted, certain kinds of soil must rest and renew, be tended to and softened before you can even contemplate the planting. And rest, it can look like so many different things. Many have rested and reflected during this pandemic. Some have discovered the nap ministry or observed new ways to keep the Sabbath. But over the last few months, as we felt the promise and beginnings of a practice of a return to normalcy, we've also felt the pressure and pull to return to a status quo that wasn't serving many of us at all. As the world continues to open up for so many this summer in the United States, I continue to wonder to what extent I have the strength to continue to explore who I might be, who we might continue to become together if we gave ourselves more space to rest and allowed ourselves more time to just be, and how that work would benefit our most marginalized communities. How about those of us who have no option in whether they rest, or who are trying desperately to reclaim a breath after the resounding depths of grief and loss? What space do we give them? What space can we give ourselves? In everything I've read and reflected on in the pandemic, what's emerged as the most sacred is the fullness and complexity of my family story, of mine and of yours. It's in tending to the real and imperfect relationships with one another that have brought me closer to the holy, to the divine, to the present. In the coming months, how shall we continue to rest? And when we are ready, till and plant and weave our stories together. Share the embodied commentaries and emboldened scriptures of one another's lives, elevating the voices that weren't ever on the reading list or in our congregational histories or in board meetings until now. When you give the soil the love and space it needs, later, that little seemingly solitary seed will find itself moving and shifting and germinating, enveloped in its sibling soil, enriched by its watery brethren, laying the groundwork together for the generative harvest to come. I invite you one more time to return to your breath. To return to your sacred text. Think on it and how it makes you feel. Which generative seeds of truth and resiliency will you tend to on this day? Or maybe what you tend to is not tending at all. Which unexamined truth texts will you invite in to traverse these softening tundras of our hearts as we rest and ready the soil for the truth telling, the truth tilling of our own that's to come?